Good morning to everyone here. Thank you very much for coming along and staying in and not running away, because I bet you all thought this was going to be a GDPR talk. Yes, you did. No need to hide it. I will admit I have to mention it a couple of times, but I'm also going to admit something else. This is not a product talk. I will not extol you the virtues of Sentinel-1, because quite frankly, there's a lot of you in this room, and it wouldn't make sense to everyone. So what I would like to do, and I think my goal for this presentation is to propose a couple of questions to you guys in terms of what the changes in current cybersecurity have meant to how you treat your employees. And it's a really important question to me, and it's a very topical question for this event, and it's a very topical question for the event that these guys are doing next, in that it turns out privacy is a very, very big concern. For those of you guys that have followed it, the last event that these guys did, they had Julian Assange as a speaker. The next event, they're having a similarly sized cybersecurity personality. And you'll notice that it's all about privacy. And this is really topical in terms of privacy, because the NSA, of course, is a three-letter agency. It's a TLA that has been in the news. And it's been in the news for the amount of surveillance that they've performed on normal, ordinary citizens. One of the questions, and I think it's a big claim to make at the start of a presentation, is that I think most ordinary organizations that are maybe not amazingly equipped, but well equipped in the cybersecurity space, perform more surveillance on their employees than the GCHQ or the NSA does on their citizens. In fact, the level of access that most organizations have to their employees' data is something that most of those organizations would be jealous of. Whether it's the fact that you guys are probably doing network inspection, you guys are doing sandboxing, you guys are doing URL filtering, you guys have got the ability to look at an endpoint and see exactly what files they accessed. You're performing the exact same sort of surveillance that these organizations want to perform. And it extends beyond endpoints and extends to things like mobiles. For those of you guys who think privacy isn't a very real concern, I worked for an organization. We installed Mobile Iron onside my laptop and my phone. And the fact that the IT admin could tell to a couple of meters accuracy exactly where I was at all times of the day, and given that it was a work phone that was with me all the time because I was on call, meant they knew where I was all the time, is a pretty big privacy concern, right? So is privacy just a buzzword? I think we'll all agree it's not, right? There are some very real concerns about what privacy means to us as people, and what privacy means to everybody. But what I would point out, and I think this is quite an interesting way of looking at it, I pulled this from the Trade Unions Congress. They meant to look after employees, is that according to the Trade Unions Congress, there are legitimate reasons why employers may wish to monitor their workforce. But excessive or unjustified monitoring of staff can cause stress, loss of trust, and low morale. And I think, and I'll get to this in a little bit of time, the lack of transparency that most organizations have in terms of what monitoring they're performing on their employees means that if they knew this would come about, right, they wouldn't trust. They wouldn't want to use their work phone. They'd leave it in a drawer. They wouldn't want to take their work laptop or their work desktop away with them. They'd want to leave it alone. I did say I had to talk about GDPR, and I'm sorry, I really don't want to, but the reason I wanted to talk about it is, quite frankly, it's enabled most organizations more to surveil their employees more than ever. And the reason for that is they've been given carte blanche, essentially. They've been given the ability to say, is this for a security purpose? I can monitor whatever I like. I can do whatever I like. I am set as the data controller, and that is such a carte blanche term. You can get away with whatever you like. This is what GDPR is defined by the ICO, and GDPR, this is it. I'm not going to read it out. You guys will have heard all of this before. Don't want to bore you to death. But some statistics that I think are interesting from the ICO is the amount of data loss that has been reported, and the amount of cybersecurity breaches that have been reported. Now, the interesting thing for me with GDPR is that from the data loss perspective, and this is very interesting, is that none of these breaches, none of these data losses are actually about their own employee data. It's all about their customers' data. But when you take a look at the amount of surveillance that we've talked about, why aren't they reporting whether a rogue admin has gotten access to a SIM tool? Why aren't they talking about whether they've properly locked down the databases that hold all of the network data? Because it's not a category under GDPR. It is not something you're meant to talk about, which I think is quite frankly quite scary. I have to talk a little bit about who I work for because they paid me to write the presentation. Well, they gave me the time to write the presentation. But I also think we're adding an interesting dynamic to the problem. Now, the reason I think it's an interesting dynamic is for those guys who've kept track of the endpoint space, you will have been able to see the amount of data that you're able to get from endpoints, the things that your employees are actually using, has risen exponentially. When you take a look at 6 years ago, the amount of data that you got from an endpoint, threat detected, threat not detected, to the data that you can get now, which goes from specific memory reads through to file opens, process opens, network actions, the amount of data that you can actually get from what your employees are using to do their job is crazy. Define EPP, I'm not going to talk about it too much. If you guys are interested in what EPP really means, come have a talk after this talk. I'll be able to spend some more time on it. But the one thing I will talk about is a little bit about EDR and a little bit about the concept of passive and active monitoring. As a Brit, I've got a sense of humour, and that sense of humour extends to, hey look, I just looked at a bath bomb on Amazon, I'm probably on a list somewhere, I've said the word bomb, right? And I think everybody in this room will be like, yeah, no, I get that, that's fine, you probably should be on a list. But the one thing is, people we do care about is whether I'm on a list without having searched for it anyway, right? The concept of the fact that all of my data can be consumed all of the time, or whether it's only going to be consumed when there's a reason for it to be consumed, so active and passive monitoring, is a big concern. And the thing with EDR, as most people are consuming it at the moment, it's pure passive monitoring. It's collecting all of the data all of the time. And one of the things I'd like to bring up at this point, and I'll get a little bit to about defining the problem, is this data, how are we segregating this from my data? From an employee's perspective and me doing my job, how are you separating that from me as a person and that key fingerprint that says it's me? And it's really important, and it's important to discuss about, because in today's society, there is no difference between this being my work laptop and this being my laptop. I've had to come up to Manchester for the day, so I've taken this with me. I've not got access to my personal machines. So it's becoming an extension of myself. So as an organization that I work for, how are they distinguishing between what's work Niall and what's home Niall? And you can't just say, as part of any employee contract, you cannot use this device for personal details, because the crossover will happen accidentally, purposefully or not. You can't control that. But this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier on. Keep your eyes peeled for the next event that these guys do. I think it'll be very interesting. This happened about 3 days ago. Very topical. I didn't plan this presentation around this coming out. Just sort of happened, thankfully. The idea that the amount of surveillance that the UK does on its citizens is a breach of our human rights. But we've already talked about the fact that in reality, most organizations take that and a step beyond. So what are we doing to our employees? Has anybody focused on this as a problem? I don't think so. As I mentioned, most organizations, you are defined as data controllers. You can do whatever you like with your employees' data. But the next set of things that I'm going to ask you about are questions that I'm going to ask to you. I can't do a real interactive session. I've got about 3-4 minutes left anyway. So the time for questions will have to be after this. With the amount of data that you guys are able to collect on your employees, and the fact that in reality there's no difference between employees' machines and your machines as an organization, and the fact that we ask most employees to keep stuff with them all the time, is there an ethics question around the amount of data that you're actually collecting? Now, I'm not talking about the actual technology about doing this. I'm talking about, Is there an ethical problem about the amount of data that you can collect on an employee who's gone away for a weekend? Are you able to distinguish between work data and not work data? And would you treat them differently? That's a great question. The concept of EDR, the idea that an employee's machine could be plugged in a hotel Wi-Fi, they're working from the hotel from the evening, they're also FaceTiming their wife. Are you able to distinguish between those two streams of traffic and store them differently and treat them differently? I'd argue that for most organizations and for myself, the organizations I worked for, the answer is no. They're treated exactly the same. The next problem I'd like to talk about is the concept of the rest of the business, understanding that you've got all this data. I used to work for they were a Fortune 50 company, they're now a Fortune 100 company. That probably gives you an idea as to who they were. They're a pretty big outsourcer. I worked for the team that looked after the logging platforms. So from my perspective, there was a scenario one day where a business manager went, you were able to find out that a user logged in from Ukraine when he shouldn't be doing so. That's great. But could you tell me what time they logged on this morning? Why is that? Well, I just want to see if they were doing their work. And that is a key concept of things you can't do, right? The idea that security data, you were given carte blanche to do it for security reasons, not HR reasons, not operational business reasons, is really important. Are you able to push back on your business if they ask for this data? IT is traditionally considered a cost center, something you plunge money into and you don't get any benefits from. Are you able to tell them no? That's a good question. One of the next questions is, are you able to demonstrate that you're only collecting the data that's needed versus what's being offered to you? As an IT guy, I'm 100% one of the people that when they go, hey, here's this shiny new toy, I click all the buttons. I turn on everything. But can I guarantee that once I'm not doing that anymore, or actually when the device goes live, that I turn off the things I don't really need as specified by the business purpose? And it's an audit that, quite frankly, a lot of organizations miss. It's an audit that when they go, yes, have you got X tools? Nobody goes, well, are you doing this on that tool? Because there's so many of them, how could you ever draw up that list? But understanding what you've got and what you're using it for should be very key. Next one, very big problem, controlling data access. Big organization, I worked as the primary logging guy. I could access every piece of data within inside the organization. Should I have been able to? 100% no. But was the tool designed to segregate that level of access? Are the tools that you're using within inside your organization that say, we provide monitoring of X attribute, are you able to say, actually, for all of these things, these people can't access it? And I'm pretty willing to guarantee the answer is no. Most tools aren't designed with this concept in mind. But it's something you should care about when you're monitoring your employees. Minimization of data, hugely important in that in reality, most organizations duplicate data left, right, and center. Take a look at your VPN client. Is it doing URL filtering? Great. You're doing URL filtering on the network? Great. Doing URL filtering via DNS? Great. That's 3 ways you've got the same amount of data. Under GDPR, not allowed to do that. But from a security perspective, have you even thought about that as a problem? Probably not. And the final one, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, and it's quite relevant in terms of the recent European ruling, is transparency. As a person who's implemented firewalls into investment banks, as a guy who's done logging for huge firms, the average employee, and I've seen the employee contracts, I got one of myself, none of it told them what the organization did with my data, how it collected it, what it did with it, and how it was ensured that it was safe. And from a perspective of everyone in this room, can you say that your employees 100% know from an IT security perspective exactly what you're doing? They might not understand. But if you're able to tell them that actually I did try to let you know what I was doing, are you covered? Maybe. So hopefully, it's been a bit less of a product pitch, a bit more of a conversation around cybersecurity, but hopefully a conversation around your responsibilities to employees. Because to me, as a guy that works in endpoint space, I know the amount of data that can be collected. I want to know what's being done with it. But thank you very much.
Niall, thank you very much indeed. A good insight into privacy and data access. Thank you. You have an opportunity to question Niall during the Q&A session in the next part of the programme. It's now time for coffee. It's a couple of minutes late. Could I ask you all to be back in here at 11:15